know it's this. It's like a perk in the talk of this shit. Money swallowed like sis. Did it perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look me better put on the road I just spit. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of What If Deku Turns Ghostrider. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of otherwise Rook on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. 3 months. Izuku was running out of time. He had to get out of Mustafa in the next few weeks, or it'd experience a rather searing heatwave. Izuku was lucky that the triplets were starting U soon, so he was able to drive them to their first day as he wanted, but would have to sacrifice it being every day, as their first week was when he'd be leaving. "You're what?" Izumi reacted about as he expected. Inko and Hisashi looked absolutely torn up and Izuka and Izuki had tears in their eyes. "Not like that," Izuku quickly said. "I mean I'm going for a drive across Japan, to explore the place, okay?" They still stared at him, obviously demanding an explanation. Izuku groaned. "Look back in the US, I'd do these little trips across the country. I always did these every few months and I enjoyed them. The point of it originally was to get away from my problems for a week, but after a while, I just kept doing them until I did them every 3 months." Izuku stopped to let his words sink in. Inko and Hisashi looked less torn and more in thought. The triplets were still staring at him, but a glimmer of understanding in their eyes told him he was on the right track. "It's become a tradition for me to do these types of drive. I'd be gone for a week, maybe 2, and that's it. Plus, I've been itching to explore Japan for a while, and this just happens to coincide." He watched his family's reactions and saw a blanket of understanding place itself in their eyes. Izuki was the first to speak up. "So you'll be back?" "Yes, I'll be gone for a week, 2 tops," Izuku said. Izuki nodded and looked at her sisters. Izumi still looked somewhat frustrated and Izuka wore a mask of indifference, though it didn't hide the turmoil of thought her eyes showed. "You have to promise." Izuku looked at Izumi, finally saying something. Izuku raised a hand. "I promise I will come back within the allotted time frame." Izumi nodded her head. "You'll call as well, right?" Izuka asked. Izuku froze and could only think of one word, SHT. Getting his family off his back, Izuku went about the rest of the week rather well. Izuku wouldn't do much around the apartment and would usually be out walking or driving. He also rediscovered his favorite noodle shop. The owners recognized him and welcomed him with open arms. He'd be sure to go there when possible. The triplets also started their high school careers at U, and he made sure to drive them there their first day. The day went by pretty slowly, and when he came to pick them up, they told him all about their day, though Izuki's day seemed far tamer compared to Izumi's and Izuka's. Their homeroom teacher Shota Aizawa, he felt he recognized that name, was a real SLV driver. The day consisted of the entire CL butt doing a quirk apprehension test, and apparently, he had threatened the whole CL butt with expulsion. Izuki was listening intently and Izuku was more focused on the road, but still listened. Izuku couldn't really fault the guy's method. It may seem cruel to them, but that was because the horror of the world hadn't truly sunk into their minds and he knew it wouldn't take that long for that to happen. He was surprised to hear that it was a ruse to get everyone to do their best. He was sure the story would have ended with at least one of them getting the boot, maybe the invisible girl Izumi mentioned. Izuki's day resembled his first day the most, an orientation with the principal giving a speech and learning about their CL butts. Her day consisted of the teacher Sekijiro explaining their schedules and what they could expect from the hero course. Izuku felt her CL butt would be a very textbook one compared to Izuka's and Izumi's, so she may not be exposed to the evils just yet. He'd take the win. The rest of the day had been quiet and night soon came. He made sure to tell his family when he was leaving, and the triplets made sure to hug him and threaten to hunt him if he wasn't back in 2 weeks. Izuku had currently been driving for several hours and had finally gotten close enough to feel the pulse he had made sure to place on the rig. The pulse was a sharp feeling of heat. He wasn't affected, but he could still sense it. He could also feel the scratching that had finally made itself known. It was faint, very faint, as if he were listening to something being scratched at behind something. He knew it wouldn't be long now as he turned off the road and into the trees. Izuku made sure the Plymouth was deep enough to where no one would see it, and then he shut the engine off and got out. Usually, Izuku would take the Plymouth to the rig as well, but it was too late for him to use his powers without setting it loose. He pats the hood of the car in a manner that would betray he was patting a child, and with that, he set off deeper into the woods, leaving the Plymouth behind. The trek into the forest was peaceful. It almost made him forget why he was there. Izuku shook his head as a scratching noise made it to his ears, but quickened his pace anyway. Izuku had gotten halfway to his destination when he smelled something only described as sulfur and ash. He immediately knew what that meant and brought up his hand. Izuku stared at his ash-ridden fingers, and how the ash would blow away, revealing the skeleton beneath. 5 years ago Izuku would have freaked out seeing this, now it just meant he was running out of time. Izuku eventually made it to a clearing, and almost sighed with relief seeing the rig parked there. The rig was an older semi-truck. He didn't actually know how old, as the previous owner had only mentioned. It was nearly 80 years old when he got it, so he just assumed it was made in the late 21st century. Izuku stumbled toward the trailer doors. He grabbed the bolt, keeping it closed, and slid it out. Izuku heaved the doors open before climbing in. The front of the trailer had a line of heavy-duty straps on the wall, and hooks on the floor several feet away from each other. The middle looked like a small workbench, wrenches, screwdrivers, and several others put in drawers on one wall, and parallel to that a small armory of weapons. Izuku wasn't interested in those, however, as he shuffled toward the far back of the trailer. Izuku made a beeline straight for an old and dismantled bike, the Armstrong MT500. Izuku finally can't take it and collapses a few steps from the bike, his pores leaking dark smoke. He crawls towards the bike and drags the LTHR jacket drped over it closer to him. Hee, well I guess it's your show now. Izuku smiles crazily as flames begin piercing his temple. Just do me. A favor, stay out of Mustafu, Izuku says, as his jaw burns away to the bone beneath. Izuku twitched as he just began to laugh. This was the transition between drivers. Izuku was consumed by the black smoke, and his laugh slowly died out. Silence reigned for a moment before movement caused the smoke to shift. An orange glow pierced the smoke as it slowly vented out of the trailer through the small openings in the side. A figure walked out of the smoke, its charred black skull and charred jacket making it look menacing. The rider was here, and it wouldn't be showing mercy. The party was regal and proper. Koichi felt as out of place as a guy could in the tux he wore. It definitely wasn't the many villains surrounding him at the party. Koichi really wanted to tear the suit off and take these villains to one-way beatdown street, but held back on the impulse for the mission. Koichi Hamawari, Aka the Crawler, was gliding through the crowd. His thoughts kept crawling back to the villain he was here to take down and the impact it would have on the Naruhata ward. He finally made it to a table and looked at his partner in vigilantism, Knuckleduster. Knuckleduster wasn't wearing his normal attire, but instead a cleanly pressed black tux, his mask being tucked and folded into his BRST pocket. He leaned on a wooden cane in his left hand, an injury from a while back and age catching up to him having messed up his leg a bit. Koichi grabbed a GL butt from the table and took a small sip. Have you seen the target? Knuckleduster didn't answer verbally but motioned to the grand staircase. Koichi looked up the steps and found the target. Dressed in a snow-white suit with a BLD red tie was the villain Starstruck. Starstruck had rolled in a few years ago and quickly took all drug rackets in Tokyo's Naruhata ward. His quirk allowed him to create superheated ball of plasma in his hands, hence the name Starstruck. Recently, rumors had spread that he was supplying trigger to a Yakuza group in the area, though the rumors were debated on which one. Koichi looked at Knuckleduster and nodded at him. He nodded back and walked away. Koichi walked back through the crowd and towards a balcony. He entered the cold night, the breeze somewhat ruffling his hair. Koichi stood and soaked the night in. He always loved the coolness of night, no matter what people said. Cold is superior to heat. Koichi looked around to make sure no one could see him. After making sure no one would see him, he walked to the wall and put his hands on them. He activated his quirk and scaled the wall easily. Koichi eventually reached an open window and climbed inside. He looked around at the crates and boxes littering the place. Koichi walked through the attic and eventually heard voices. He ducked behind a box to listen to two guards talking to each other. That's what I'm saying, the shipment was attacked. The left guard said. How? That shipment was kept secret from the heroes, our police contacts made sure of that. The right guard said. I don't know, man. All I know is the boss is gonna be PS said when he hears about this, and we're probably gonna have a need for a few new paid officers. Koichi had been confused when he heard this. He thought the shipment was next week, but also the fact it was attacked meant he and Knuckleduster's job was done for them. He didn't know how to feel about that. More importantly, he wondered who had gotten to the shipment first. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a loud engine that seemed to get closer. The guards must have heard it too as they tensed and grabbed their walkie-talkies. Yo, what's that noise? He didn't get to finish as an orange light flashed from the street and a loud crash sounded from the ballroom below. Koichi and the guards were caught off guard and Koichi tripped on his feet and alerted the guards to his presence. CRP, Koichi said. Knuckleduster had seen many things in his life, but a skeleton biker with his head on fire took the number 2 spot. He, like many of the patrons, had heard the growing roar of an engine getting closer. He had glanced up to Starstruck and saw him talking to his personal guards about something. He seemed pretty miffed too. And then a bright orange flash filled the room and the sound of shattering GL butt and screams filled his ears. He blinked as his vision came back and narrowed his eyes at the sight in front of him. An inferno of orange and a white skull, with a LTHR jacket that seemed to be melting and charred. He could have sworn he saw the jacket actually bubble in a few places. The rider scanned the room, its gaze making everyone shake in fear, a primal instinct to survive flaring. Finally, its gaze fell on Starstruck and it just stared. Seconds P-butted and Starstruck grew a spine. Kill him, he roared, activating his quirk. Gunfire ripped through the air and Knuckleduster dove behind a table to avoid getting hit. The rider stood its ground, letting the projectiles hit it. A few quills from someone's quirk aimed at its skull melted before they hit their target, and through it all the rider stared. Starstruck charged up a plasma sphere and aimed it towards the rider. He smirked before chucking it. The sphere soared towards the rider, which showed no reaction. It got closer, and finally, the rider's hand struck out, catching the superheated plasma sphere. Everything went quiet. Knuckleduster looked around at the attendants and guards, all of them gaping at the rider holding something so hot it could melt through several inches of thick steel. The rider looked at the sphere, tossed it around with its hands, and added its own fire to the sphere. Starstruck started shaking, and the rider seemed to present the sphere, now blue in color and wisping off in any general direction. Heh, the rider chuckled raspily. It spun on the ball of its foot and threw the plasma ball back at Starstruck. The ball flew through the air as it left a trail of blue and the floor underneath caught fire. People it P-butted were set ablaze and screamed in agony as the fire ate away at them. Starstruck attempted to catch the ball but found his hands burning as he reached out. Ah, he screamed before the ball slammed into his chest. The heat was too much for his body to handle as the flesh, muscle, nerves, and bone all turned to ash. Screams and frantic footfalls towards the doors were the only noises Knuckleduster could hear. He watched the crowd try to leave, but was intercepted by the Armstrong moving itself in front of the door, chains oozing from its exhaust pipe and anchoring itself to the wall. Fire erupted from the floor and flooded the guards, somehow missing Knuckleduster as he stood close to the guards. He reached for his mask and put it on before he moved towards the rider and got close enough to see it turn its head at him. Knuckleduster raised the cane and swung it strong. Crack! The rider's head snapped away from Knuckleduster as the cane broke from the force. Sorry, Matchstick. Can't let you kill any more people, Knuckleduster yelled. The rider looked back at Knuckleduster and its jaw was hanging from one side. The sight made him grin. The rider grabbed its jaw and snapped it back into place. There went Knuckleduster's smirk. Knuckleduster reared a fist back, but a chain snaked around his forearm and yanked him off the ground. He struggled as the chains wrapped him up and suspended him above the room. The rider ignored him in favor of the people trying to leave. It walked forward, knuckle style, and was socked across the temple by Koichi. I won't let you hurt those people, he exclaimed. The rider was sent flying across the hall and directly into the stairs, and a small crater formed behind the rider's body. A beat P-butted as the rider lay there before it slowly got up and stared into the vigilante's eyes, not without brushing off his shoulder even though the concrete was melted away already. Koichi activated his quirk and sped towards the rider, holding up his hands. Shooty-G, Koichi tried to yell, but a hand clamped over his mouth. Koichi's eyes widened. The rider had moved so fast he hadn't even seen it move. One moment it's in front of the pillar, and the next he's being held off the ground by his jaw. He clawed at the hand to try to get it off, but the rider's grip was ironclad. "Shut up," the rider rasped. Koichi felt cold snakes creep across his chest and was soon pulled out of the rider's grip and up above the floor. The chains pulled until he was near Knuckleduster. The rider returned his gaze to the crowd of people all shaking in terror. He walked closer even as the vigilantes tried to get its attention back on them. They were both wasting their time, and they weren't drenched in sin. Both had what it had considered a hero's soul. The rider stopped and gazed over the crowd, singling them out. They continued begging for mercy, squealing like pigs to slaughter. It ignored their pleas as it continued the observation: greed, wrath, sloth, lust. They were all guilty. Everyone in the crowd was a criminal of the worst regard, and no mercy was shed for their victims, so why should it shed any? The rider roared fire at the crowd, its jaw opening unnaturally. Screams and cries of the depraved were like a symphony to the rider. It continued unleashing fire upon the crowd until only the noise of the roaring flames remained. The rider clamped its jaw shut and dispelled the fire. Ash and some fragments of bone were all that remained. The rider could sense the dread from its vigilante captives. Surprisingly, it was more for the victims than themselves. It put the vigilantes out of its mind as its senses flared. The rider brought its hand up and rubbed the left palm with its right hand. Its head snapped in the direction of the sin. The Armstrong drove up beside the rider, and it hopped on, but before leaving it unraveled the chains keeping the vigilantes bound, and sped off back out the hole it came. Knuckleduster and Koichi lay there both deep in thought about the villain that had crashed their operation. Different scenarios and reasons circled through their minds, but one thing was prevalent. Why didn't he kill us? Izuku stood in a large and appealing chamber. Izuku was confused for a moment before what he buttomed, guards ran by. He took note of their garments and buttomed he was somewhere in ancient Egypt. The guards didn't take note of Izuku as they ran towards a large throne that had appeared from fire. Izuku got closer and could only listen as the guards talked to the man sitting on the throne. He couldn't understand them, but he could tell they were panicking. The man didn't seem worried though. Izuku decided to take a look around at the architecture. He had been to Egypt once and found it to be quite appealing. The golden arches that held the ceramic roof and the many hieroglyphics decorated the walls. He cursed that he couldn't use his notebook. Izuku finally looked back at the guards and man. They were still talking when an explosion rocked the place. Izuku watched as the man still stayed calm with an almost arrogant smile on his face. The guards were panicking, their spears pointed toward the grand doors. The doors blew open. Fire streamed into the room, scorching the walls and floor. The guards leapt back from the flames and still shakily pointed their weapons at the door. Izuku wasn't really surprised that fanaticism will go a long way even in the face of death. Out of the fire came a somewhat feminine figure, an ashen white cloak that was longer in the back. Her torso and legs were covered by a more white cloth. Izuku looked at the figure and smiled. He had an idea what this was, not just because of the flaming skeleton. Izuku watched as the ancient rider strode through the hall. The man on the throne was still arrogantly smiling as the other two quaked in their sandals. The rider walked right up to them. It glanced at the two and seemed to snarl in the same language the other three had used. It seemed whatever the rider said finally shattered their resolve, and both ran out of the room. Izuku stared at the two running away. Izuku was always surprised when the rider spared people. It didn't happen often in these dream memories, and it never happened with him. When the rider was locked onto a target, it'd kill everyone working for them. The man, who by now he just buttomed was some kind of pharaoh or something, leaned on his arm and spoke with an arrogant tone that just made Izuku want to wrap him up with his chain. The pharaoh continued to speak as the rider got closer. The spirit ignored every word and continued up the path. Izuku followed after watching the environment slowly burn away into a void of flowing ash. The pharaoh stopped with a smirk as the rider stood directly in front of them. They stood for a moment before reaching out and violently hoisting the pharaoh up by the neck. The pharaoh finally lost the smirk and frantically began saying something. The rider didn't care as they forced the pharaoh to look them in the eye. Izuku rubbed his hands together in anticipation. He always loved seeing it from an outsider's POV. The pharaoh's face twisted in agony as the writer opened their mouth. His eyes began losing their blue shine and slowly turned gray. A blue light spewed from his eyes and into the writer's mouth. Its mouth shut with an audible click. The writer looked at the soulless corpse and let it fall as the flowing ash flooded Izuku and everything went black. Izuku slowly oozed back into consciousness. He wished he didn't immediately as a splitting headache made itself known. If there was one thing Izuku really hated about the writer being in control for a straight week, it was the goddamn headache afterward. At least it was better than the first few times. He really hated those months. Izuku chose to keep his eyes closed and just ride it out. They never lasted very long. Eventually, the headache went from splitting to manageable. He slowly opened his eyes and found himself in a rather dilapidated church. It was also slanted somewhat with sunlight bleeding through cracks in the ceiling. Izuku pushed himself up and found he was on the stage where he assumed the preacher would stand and preach the gospel. He also took note of the fact that it was somewhat ironic that he tended to find himself wrapped up in religion. The writer itself could be considered a demon, and he thought it was originally as well, but it was quick to give a very vague and convoluted answer that only answered one question, and that it wasn't a demon or anything human-related. Still wouldn't answer him with words though. He looked around for a moment at the church, studying its features until he finally stood up and cracked his neck. He'd definitely be putting this place in his notebook. Izuku made his way past the rotted chairs and dusty stone statues toward the entrance. He put his hand up to block the sun from trying to kill his eyes. He moved into the morning sun and looked around. The first thing he noticed was the Armstrong resting against the brick wall of the church and the fact that said church was definitely sunk into the ground. He walked to the Armstrong and momentarily looked it over. The writer's powers tended to fix most broken things back to their original state. Because of that, he had begun gutting the Armstrong for parts and selling them to people who need them. He opened the saddlebag hanging off it and grabbed a notebook marked Wonders of the World #13. Izuku flipped it open and walked toward the center of the clearing and turned toward the church once he reaches it. Izuku makes a small doodle of the church and writes about how he found it and a few possibilities for its future. He stopped and momentarily thought about bringing the rig here. He thought about the pluses and realized the church could work as a home for him in Japan. With that thought, Izuku walked back into the church and began muttering to himself about placements. The weapons could go there. He moved from the small altar with a faded mural of the Virgin Mary. The rig could probably be parked on the side, and the old storeroom on the west wing could have the wall torn down and used as a garage. Izuku walked through the storeroom, which was mostly barren, and the only reason he knew it was the storeroom was because of the hanging plaque on the door. Izuku wrote down all the ideas he had and then closed the book before returning to the Armstrong. He puts it back in the saddlebag before taking another thing out of the saddlebag, a matte black biker helmet, and hopped on the bike. Izuku places the helmet on his head and turns towards the woods, scanning the tree line and looking for the path the writer took here. His eyes finally land on a rather scorched path that was burned by the Armstrong. He turns the bike and drives through the path. The trail stretched on for close to an hour if Izuku was counting right, but eventually he came to a gravel road. Izuku stopped and looked down the sides of the road, trying to decide which way he should go. Shrugging, he turns right and speeds off. The gravel road eventually takes him to a highway that he follows until he hits a town and drives around to find a library or some kind of computer place so he could use a computer. He needed to know the damage the writer had caused, and since he barely even got fuzzy memories from his time being possessed, he really needed to see the news. Izuku rolled to a stop on the side parking of several buildings. He turned the engine off and kicked the stand down so the bike didn't fall. He looked around at the people walking around. He was pleasantly surprised to see no one looking at the Armstrong in recognition. Most didn't even look at it, just moving off to wherever they were going. Izuku took the helmet off and placed it in the saddlebag before walking toward the store he had stopped for. Izuku walked through the sliding doors of the store and waved towards the cashier, who waved back before walking towards a sign reading computers. Izuku walked over to a display of several laptops. He opened one up and the screen powered on to show a system locked pop-up. Izuku looked around and put his hand on the screen. The screen glowed orange and then the system lock lifted. Izuku signed in as a guest and brought up Rugal. Izuku scrolled to the news and clicked on the tab. Flaming skeleton villain terrorizes northern Japan. DRGS Lords murdered by metal album cover reject. Known vigilantes in Tokyo scene escaping scene of the skeleton villains second and butthacker. The HPSC releases statement on the rampage of the skeleton villain. Izuku stared at the first few things that popped up and hung his head while releasing a sigh. Goddammit. Sir Nightai looked up from the folders and over the table, observing the heroes that had arrived for this meeting. Most of them are talking amongst themselves or staying away from people waiting for the meeting to start. He looked back at the folders and gets everyone's attention by tapping his high-density seals on the table. Hello, I'm sure you all know why you are here, Sir Nightai began. 1 week ago one of the worst villain attacks in Japan's history began. Over 38 hours ago it finally stopped. This would usually be a call for celebration, but unfortunately, it wasn't stopped by a hero. The villain stopped his rampage and disappeared without a single sign of where he went. Nightai opened the folder and picked up a black and white photo presenting its back to the meeting. The villain is believed to be a multinational criminal, a serial killer proficient in evading capture and has still yet to be identified. The heroes look at each other most confused about what Nightai's getting at, while others are surprised that this villain is multinational. His identity is completely unknown as his features are believed to be a result of a somewhat late mutant quirk awakening. Because of this, he is only known by his nickname, given by the heroes and police department in Jackson, Missouri of the United States. Sir Nightai turns the photo around and ignores the small gasps emitting from a few of the heroes. The ghostrider. Nightai hands out a few other photos to the heroes and they peabut them around. This meeting is to get the word out. The writer is a very dangerous individual with a powerful quirk and the will to use it. Nightai grabs a remote and turns towards a screen. He presses a button and the screen displays a newspaper report from America, translated in Japanese. His first appearance seemed to show the writer in a burnt vehicle rocketing down the freeway. At first it was believed he was just a street punk deciding he wanted to test his quirk to the limits. It was much worse than that. A hero that could keep pace with the vehicle was sent to stop him, and when the hero didn't report in after an hour more heroes were sent, and they made a rather shocking discovery. He hit another button and a crime scene photo popped up. Most of the heroes were shocked by the image, others were angered. The hero was murdered, but that's not what shocked people. He was dragged at nearly 100 miles per hour on concrete, and as you can see he was torn apart. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only casualty. Later that day several civilians and known villains were found burned severely, and none survived. A gloved fist slammed into the table. And you're telling us this guy hasn't been caught yet? Nightai looked at the heroine who yelled out, "Yes, Mirko, that's exactly what I'm saying." Mirko growled but stayed quiet to listen to Nightai. The ghostwriter's original rampage was sporadic and random, killing anyone that came across him. Thankfully no kids were killed. This rampage continued across half of the US for close to 2 months. The heroes were once again shocked by this information and why they didn't know about this. Afterward the writer disappeared and wasn't spotted for several weeks, though where he was surprised people. Nightai pressed another button on the remote and the screen once again changed to a map of America's continent. A red dot was shown farther north and in Canada. He somehow made it past the American-Canadian border without incident, which is a very difficult thing to do normally, and I don't need to say how difficult it'd be for a known villain. Nightai himself was surprised at this when he learned of it. The US had always been heavy-handed with their border defense. It had only increased when quirks arose, and if this villain could get past those defenses without incident, that was a very scary thought. "I have a question," a voice interrupted Nightai's thoughts. He looked at the end of the table and saw it was Edshot. If this villain is so notorious, how haven't we heard of him? A lot of the heroes nodded at his question and looked to Nightai for an answer. Unfortunately, it was a matter that simply didn't involve Japan, considering for the 4 years the ghostwriter has been active. He'd only been in the Americas and occasionally Europe. It was simply not our problem in a saying. Of course, that has changed, and we are to receive all case files on the writer. Nightai turns the projector to an image of the writer caught on a highway security camera. I've read a few files that had come over already. Most of them pertain to earlier cases, but one file was from a detective named Cyrus Blaze. He wrote down and put his own theories as to how the writer works, and one of them serves a rather key purpose. Nightai brings up a file and looks at it. He states in the file that the writer seems to strike very briefly. Most of the time he will show up and then disappear, but a pattern had formed a year after the first sightings. I will quote Mr. Blaze here, 3 months, that's all you'll have. The writer seems to go on a reckless rampage across the country every 3 months. I don't know why, and I don't know if he does for kicks. We haven't stopped him, but you do your best and catch the BSTRD. Night Eye places the file down and looks up at the heroes gathered. Well, let us not disappoint Mr. Blaze, Endeavor spoke up. I'll personally bring him in, he declared. Most of the heroes nodded, but Night Eye looked at him and shook his head. No, everyone looked at Night Eye as if he grew a second head. It's not that I doubt your capability, I simply don't believe you'd be a good matchup. The writer, just like you, has a fire quirk, and just like you, fire doesn't seem to harm him. It most likely wouldn't be a good idea. Endeavor went to retort, but actually thought about the matchup and sat back down and grumbled in agreement, much to his own annoyance. But in regards to Mr. Blaze's request, Night Eye's eyes strengthened slightly. I will make this declaration. The ghostwriter has terrorized most of the world, and he believes he can do the same here. Well, I say he couldn't have picked a worse place to come. Japan is the modern pillar of heroism, and millions of heroes are out and patrol the country. Our very own symbol of peace. All Might is here, and Japan is the writer's next stop. But it will also be his last. 2 weeks. That hadn't felt real to Izuku. It felt like the past 2 weeks had gone by far faster than it should have. He'd moved the rig and all his stuff into the church, even knocked down that wall, and made a garage out of the storage room, all in 2 weeks. It felt strange having an actual home again. Over the past several years, he mostly drifted in the Plymouth, sleeping in the back of the car. When he got the rig, he slept in the larger cabin of the semi. Not once had he paid for a hotel room or rented a house, so it felt different, not a bad different, just different. He also couldn't help the bubble of frustration that came up when his mind decided to wander back to 2 weeks ago, when he came back from his trip. Apparently, while he was gone, villains attacked Yueya's unforeseen simulation joint and CL-1A. Izuka and Izumi got caught in that, and he was angry and frustrated that he wasn't there. The only thing that didn't make him go ballistic was the fact that neither of them had gotten hurt. But they had seen a few things that made him want to hunt down this Tamura Shigaraki and this League of Villains. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option, as he couldn't risk being caught. 2 weeks hadn't even slowed the search for the ghostwriter, and he doubted it'd stop anytime soon. Plus, the news had finally caught wind of the writer's multinational villain status. God, the articles were filled with so much hero criticism. He felt almost sorry for the heroes who had to deal with them now. Though even if Izuku couldn't hunt Shigaraki and the League of Villains, he still marked his name in his list. Izuku never thought he'd have even written a name on the page of names he'd hunted personally while in Japan. He was so sure there wouldn't be as much crime as there was. He had read the statistics for crying out loud. They had even stated that because of All Might and, even though he wasn't as mentioned, Endeavor, the crime rate had gone down to 6% and had been rather steady the last few years. Izuku stopped his train of thought, refocused on what he was doing, and resumed securing a wire to the church wall. Izuku had been doing his best to get the church into a more livable space for himself, and one of those was electricity. He didn't need it for the internet or any quality of life things. He needed it so he could see at night without lighting his hand on fire, and so he could work with his weapons. A few years ago, Izuku rediscovered his knack for industrial manufacturing when he worked in a factory for a few months before moving on. He even made a stun button that was actually very effective, so much so that he was rather surprised when he tested it out back in the States. 1 year ago. Izuku stood with his hood up in an alleyway, writing in a small pocket book as he muttered on about the voltage and power of the custom-made shock button. Voltage is fairly high, not capable of killing however, which suits my purposes as staying O. A groan of pain interrupted him. Izuku glanced down at the poor BSTRD who had just tried to rob him a few minutes ago and had become a test dummy for his shock button. Guy went down in 2 hits, the first making him grab his stomach and shrink into himself, the second one to the neck dropped him to the ground. Izuku kicked the man in the jaw, knocking him out, and continued writing. Off the police and heroes' radar when not transformed. Now, Izuku would admit his engineering prowess was better with vehicles and the occasional faulty AC unit. His family had learned this as well after the specially made air filter system in the apartment was on the fritz a few days after coming back home, and he had fixed it for them. Izuku had fixed several other things around that apartment after that. If he didn't know any better, they probably saw him as some handyman they could call on whenever they wanted. Izuku moved from the now secured wire and turned towards a small gasoline generator he bought from a strongware store. Izuku rubbed his gloved hands together. "Please work," Izuku said on the generator. "Please work." He turned towards the light bulbs he installed on the walls and crossed his fingers. "Please work." A slight glow started in one of the bulbs and slowly the others followed before they began glowing, illuminating the room. Izuku jumped in the air, pumping his fist and cheering. "Finally, took 7 tries, but I did it." Izuku had been working to get the lights on for days. The original electrical work had decayed far too heavily for him to fix, so he had to get rather simple with the wiring. The wires were secured and exposed on the walls, and the lights were mounted on wood panels. Izuku had spent a few hours getting up the first day, and the next several days were spent just trying to get the DMN things to turn on. The first time he tried turning on the lights, they caught fire. The second time, the bulbs exploded, which made no sense to Izuku. The third time, they just didn't turn on. The fourth was the reason he was now wearing gloves. The fifth he didn't even want to remember. The sixth was the reason he was resecuring the wires. All in all, he was really happy the seventh didn't destroy the church. A buzzing noise caught his attention, and he turned to see his phone vibrating on the old bench he kept. Izuku walked over while taking off his gloves. He grabbed it and looked at the ID to see it was Enko. "Yeah, Mom?" "Hello, dear. I called because have a bakugou here with your name on it," Enko said as Izuku tensed. "For me?" "Yes, it was sent by this rather nice person who had been sending us things ever since you left, and apparently they know you've come home." Izuku was quiet for a moment. "Does it have a sender name?" "Ooh, yes, actually, hold on." Noises come from the phone as he budooms. Enko is grabbing it. "It says Dumb Bunny." Izuku's eyes light up at the name. It's a mixture of happiness with a slight pinch of dread. "I always wondered why they chose that and didn't just leave a better name." "I'll be there later today." "Okay, Izuku, I'll tell the triplets, and they can tell you about the upcoming sports festival." "All right, see you later, Mom." "See you soon, dear." Izuku hung up and placed the phone in his pocket. He moved towards the nail protruding from a wall he used to hang his overcoat on and grabbed it on his way out. Izuku moved the tarp he hung on the entrance aside and walked into the afternoon sun. He looked over at the Plymouth, which was parked next to the rig currently detached from its trailer. Izuku strode over to the Plymouth and hopped in. He didn't start the car immediately, instead reaching for the glove box and take out an old photo. Izuku looked at the photo, his face wistful as he thought of the past. Welp, time to face the past again. Izuku placed the photo showing him in his old Yua coveralls and a bronze-skinned girl with crimson eyes and rabbit ears in the normal Yua hero course uniform posing with Yua gates behind them. Izuku walks into the lobby of the apartments. The receptionist looks up and smiles at him. "Hello, Midoriya, how's it going?" Izuku nods towards her. "It's good. Niai, how's your brother?" He walks toward the desk and stops in front of it. "Oh, he's better, thank Kami. Apparently he'll be able to come home in a few days." "That's good. Anyway, I gotta get up to my family, so talk to you later. Niai." Maki Niai nods with a small smile and Izuku turns toward the elevator and enters. Izuku listens to the music as he waits for it to stop on the floor. The elevator opens and he strides out. Izuku knocks on the apartment door and is met by Hisashi, who smiles as he sees Izuku. "Ah, hello Izuku." "Hey, Dad," Izuku responds. Hisashi moves aside and lets Izuku in. He barely makes it 4 steps, and he notices the lack of 3 certain sisters. "Where are the triplets?" "Oh, the UA Sports Festival is in a few days. They're out training for it," Hisashi responds before turning towards the hall. "Enko, Izuku's here." A thud and some footfalls signaled Enko's entrance to the living room. "Oh, hello dear." She walked up to Izuku and handed him an envelope. "The mail that came for you." Izuku took it and looked at Enko. "Thanks, Mom." "So, you doing anything later?" Enko asked. "No, not really." Enko clapped her hands together. "Well, Hisashi and I decided that since the triplets have been working so strong for the upcoming sports festival, we'd treat them to a movie night at the show." "You mean the movies?" "Yes, onto my point. Would you like to come with us?" Izuku thought for a moment. He hadn't really done much with his family when he came back besides watching TV with the triplets and occasionally listening to Hisashi complain about the woes of office work. Izuku would admit to having written several pages of notes about those rants that he'll forever use to scare himself into never getting an office job. Why not? I think I'll enjoy it. Inko beamed and hugged Izuku, who reciprocated. Inko broke the hug and walked over to the house phone to call the triplets. Izuku stood in place smiling but glanced at the enclosed letter in his hand. He'd have to read that later. Izuku placed it in a concealed pocket in his overcoat and walked over to his parents. Izuku entered the church and collapsed onto one of the old benches he'd been using as a bed. The movie was all right. It was somewhat surprising to know the rest of his family had become rather fond of old pre-quirk-related movies. Several thoughts went through Izuku's head about random things before landing on a rather important one he had in the back of his head throughout the whole time at the movies. He reached into his coat and grabbed the envelope. He reads the very familiar nickname and just repeats it in his head before tearing the envelope open and taking out its content. He holds the card in his hand and sees it's a VIP butt to the UA Sports Festival with a specific room number on the corner. Only one thing came to Izuku. I need to go to the sports festival and hope she doesn't knock my head off my shoulders. Izuku walked through the hall with a sense of foreboding. Izuku hadn't seen her in years. He never said he was leaving, and honestly that was something he regretted. She was a very fiery person, who would rather punch someone than watch someone get punched. The kind of gal you could guarantee would fight over the last piece of pizza in the box. True story. Honestly, Izuku would be lucky not to get kicked by her. Izuku stopped walking and looked at the door to the private VIP booth. He breathed in and out before knocking on the door with a rhythm. Not even a second butted when the door opened and Izuku was grabbed by his collar and dragged into the room, being thrown roughly to the ground. Izuku barely got a look at the buttolent when a weight dropped on him and a punch was thrown into his jaw. That was for disappearing for 6 years. A female voice growled. Izuku looked up and bright crimson met dim emerald. Yup, I deserved that, Izuku agreed. And? She growled. I'm an idiot. And? I should have said something before I left. And? Your long lashes are nice. She nodded. They are, yes. Her eyes locked onto his again. And what else? I preferred your original hero outfit, Izuku said, making her frown lessen in confusion. Why? Because you show so much butt. You make plumbers jealous. Hey, I have this outfit for mobility and fanservice. Fanservice? You mean so hentai artists don't need to imagine much? Her eyebrow twitched. 6 years, and you're still able to get under my skin with minimal effort. You make it easy, Rumi, plus I doubt the leotard really makes that difficult. Rumi Usajima Aka the rabbit hero, Mirko. Izuku met Rumi back in middle school after breaking her nose in a fight caused by some kid's quirk. Rumi had tracked Izuku down and began talking to him. She respected Izuku for getting a few good hits in as, apparently, Izuku was the first in the school to actually get a really good hit off. They became friends and stuck by each other all the way to UA. Rumi was in the hero course while Izuku was in general studies with engineering. They still got together and went to arcades, parks, restaurants, and even underground fight rings. Rumi stared at Izuku. FCKU, Izuku. I mean we could, but I'm not into doing that in public, Izuku replied, earning a snort from Rumi. Or do you actually want to, considering where you're sitting? Rumi blinks to then realize she had been straddling Izuku's pelvis the entire time. She stands up and reaches a hand out to Izuku, who takes it and lets himself get dragged up. Rumi backed up a little and puts her hands on her hips. She looks at Izuku's attire and says, "Well, you certainly let yourself go." Izuku was wearing the same overcoat, slight tears and all, a light gray collared shirt, and worn jeans. Izuku looks down at himself and then back up. I was going for the hobo look, but letting myself go works. Really? Rumi raised a brow. You were going for that look? Yeah, keeps all the women who kept flocking this magnificent mug away. Yeah, but you look like you haven't showered or slept in a week. I'll have you know I got a good 5-hour nap a day ago, and I took a shower before I came here. Oh, is that so? Yeah, so you got a problem with my clothing choice as well as my face now. Yeah, I do have issues with it. I preferred the young teenage rogue look you had. Well, I'm not 19 anymore and neither are you. And I preferred your Yua hero suit, at least that one had breathes. I don't need breathes. My legs can take the worst impacts now, so I don't need those things. Besides, it's easier to move without them. Yeah, but what about the cold? Rumi opened her mouth to retort, but stopped as she realized where this was going. Rumi, you know DMN well, the colder months are hell for you. That leotard does not warm you up whatsoever, and even if it did, the fact you don't have breathes means you leave your hips susceptible to the cold. You need to stay warmer than usual, as your quirk does more than give you thighs that can in fact save lives. I have a winter outfit, Rumi mumbled like a scolded child. You mean that aviator jacket? The thing that only covers your arms and leaves your legs uncovered. Besides that, the name escapes me, so I'll just call it a thigh-high boots, Rumi interrupted. They're boots that reach my thigh. Izuku looks at her incredulously, as if the very thing they're called didn't do anything but make him more confused. Thigh-high boots, he repeated. Rumi nodded. Those things, he points at the purple thigh-high boots, are socks with armor on the feet, not boots. Don't even get me started on. As Izuku continued ranting about Rumi's choice of hero outfit, he didn't notice she was walking closer to him. Izuku didn't even notice the distance between the two had closed enough to where Rumi wrapped her arms around Izuku and pulled him into a hug. Izuku stopped his rant as Rumi spoke. I missed you, you big idiot. She then whacked him on the back of the head, but I didn't miss the dissing of my thing's jackbutt. Izuku rubbed the back of his head. It's not a diss, it is a critical review of your horrible fashion choices. Before Rumi could retort, a loud voice blared through the walls. Hello, world? Both Rumi and Izuku immediately moved to a small sofa in the viewing room, Rumi hopping over it while Izuku sat down normally. And welcome to the annual US Sports Festival, the crowd cheered. I'm your gracious and fantastic host, Present Mike, and with me as my co-host the sleepyhead himself, Shota Aizawa. Stop being so loud, the voice that was probably Aizawa groused before Mike went off again, ignoring the grouch. And to our viewers at home, we thank you for tuning in. Now let us get this party started. The crowd once again cheered for the event to begin. Rumi embudged her ears somewhat from the noise. As Present Mike began announcing the CL butts that would be participating, Izuku was on the lookout for his sisters, and once the first batch of students came out, he took note of 2 heads of green. Izuku grinned as he opened a suitcase he definitely had with him the entire time, even if Rumi had no clue where the hell it came from. He opened it and mumbled, My time has come. From the suitcase came custom shirts he'd made with the help of Inko and some logistical support from Hisashi. Of course, the logistics were on the best ways to embarrass his siblings, but hey, that's what family does. Izuku took his coat off and tossed it over the back of the sofa as he grabbed a shirt with a picture of a young Izumi, Izuka, and Izuki in homemade hero costumes and the caption The Green Team. Izuku grinned as he checked it over. The pictures he used were from 10 years ago when Halloween came around. The triplets had wanted to have custom costumes to wow their CL butt mates, so Inko, Hisashi, and Izuku had all come together to do exactly that. Izuku had asked the triplets to draw what they wanted, and he had gotten 3 pictures of the triplets in a green outfit. All done in crayon, of course. The costumes were, of course, absolutely adorable and could in fact be lorded over the heads of each triplet. So Izuku decided to break out some old pictures and place them on a few shirts. Izuku looked back down at the students participating and finally saw the 3rd head of green he was looking for. Rumi was looking over at him with a raised eyebrow, and when Izuku noticed, he explained, I'm rooting for my sisters and showing my support by embowbutting the hell out of them. Rumi snorted while looking at the suitcase sitting on the couch. Can I get in on this? She asked. Sure, Izuku answered. I expected you'd ask, so I packed a custom hat just for you. He ended with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Rumi looked over at the suitcase to notice the white bill of a baseball cap sticking out. Assuming that was the one he meant, she grabbed it and held it up to examine it and finally saw what he meant. She looked at Izuku with an eyebrow raised in amusement as he responded with a smirk. Rumi donned the hat with her nickname. So, how's it feel to know everyone can tell you're a dumb bunny? Izuku asked. Feels great, broccoli man, Rumi responded dryly. I'm sure it does, Izuku raised an eyebrow at the name. And broccoli man? Really? Rumi shrugged. It was the first thing that came to mind. Izumi was pumped. She was ready to make a splash and kick the butts of everyone in this competition. Her sisters were no exception. Not even her boydo friend, yes boyfriend, was safe. She bounced on the ball of her feet in excitement as the announcements kept on going. She of course ignored it as she was strategizing on how to kick the tails of each of her CL butt mates and the other CL butt that Izuku was in. She wasn't too worried about her sisters as she knew she could beat them if Izuku didn't pull that push bullshit. She didn't even register Midnight being revealed as the referee or whatever. She didn't care. Izumi went over the CL buttmate she knew would give her trouble and ignored the CL buttmates she could easily kick in the crotch and win. Didn't matter what gender you were. Ida was a threat simply because of his speed. Izumi wasn't so prideful to discard the fact she was definitely slower in comparison, even if she manipulated the fire she made from her throat to send her flying. It was probably best to keep dodging and zigzag around whatever field they would eventually fight in. Ida wasn't too good at sharp turns. Todoroki was going to be a beach to handle with his precise and not so precise use of ice. Izumi was confident in her fire, but she knew it was practically a small spark compared to Endeavor's, so she knew she couldn't just melt through the ice quick enough, so it'd probably be best to boost herself above the ice. As Izumi continued her analysis of who would give her the most trouble, her eyes reached a VIP booth that was walled off and behind a GL-butt window. She blushed in a mixture of embarrassment and terror. Izuku was standing in the VIP box, and he was wearing a shirt with her old Halloween costume. Oh God, was that the rabbit hero, Mirko next to him. Izumi let her head fall into her hands as she groaned. Oh Kami no tilde. Are you okay, Izumi? Apparently, her suffering was heard by Izuka as she asked her if she was okay. Izumi didn't answer and just pointed toward the VIP box. Izumi butoomed Izuka followed her pointing because now she was not saying anything, nor does she seem to be breathing. Izumi whacks Izuka's arm and snaps her out of the trance. Izuka's face brightens to a spotlight crimson as she just stutters random curses and other things under her breath. What's going on? And of course, Izuki is now popping into the conversation. Izumi and Izuka just pointed up at the VIP box holding the culprit of their embarrassment. Izuki looks up to see the exact same thing the others. But instead of ceasing to breathe, she simply sniffles. More sniffles come from her as both Izumi and Izuka look at her to see the most radiant smile in response to Izuku's stunt. Why are you smiling? Izumi shouts, her cheeks still dusted red. Because he's rooting for us even after after everything tilde Izuki's full-on crying happy tears now. Izumi and Izuka stare at Izuki with incredulous faces but slowly morph into a more understanding look. It was true when they thought about it, they honestly hadn't expected Izuku to be so supportive of them after what had happened, but there he was, rooting for them in his own way, even if it was embarrassing. Izumi and Izuka looked back at the VIP box and smiled. They were going to interrogate Izuku on how he'd gotten the N4 hero to wear that DMN shirt though. Izuku watched as the sports festival finally started with the first course. A kilometer obstacle race around the UA stadium with the finish line as the entrance back into the stadium. He and Rumi watched as all the UA first years got to the tunnel where they'd begin. Izuku was excited to watch his sisters do their best in the festival. When Midnight told the racers to go, chaos ensued as people got stuck in the tunnel with all of them trying to get out first. A moment later ice consumed the tunnel and a kid with red and white hair ran through with the ice following his steps. A moment after that, several other kids using their quirks got through and followed after him. Izuka was carving through the ice path with fire billowing out of her mouth and was followed by the other two of the trio. Some blonde was screeching at Izuki with indignation. As he skated alongside them, Izuki looked at him with a guilty expression while Izuka and Izumi looked annoyed. A rumble shook the trio as they looked up to see the 0-pointers from the entrance exam. Izuku recognized them from the triplets telling him about them when they spoke of the exam, and he had to admit he wasn't sure if the students should have had to deal with these things as a test. The 0's pointers were made to look like chumps, though when the kid with red and white hair used his ice to completely freeze one of them and just pea-butted under it as if it were a morning run. The triplets followed after Candy and barely got past the frozen 0 pointer before it fell over blocking most of the other contestants. One kid who seemed to use explosions to propel themselves forward flew over the fallen Z pointer and landed into a run next to the triplets, as well as shouting something at the three before making himself propel forward with his explosions. Izumi seemed to be ticked at whatever the boy had said and broke from the group and manipulated the fire streaming from her mouth to her hands and propelled herself forward similar to the explosion kid. The other two sisters seemed more annoyed with Izumi than the other kid. Eventually, the participants reached the second obstacle, which was a large pit trap with ropes you climb across to several pillars to get across. The triplets managed well enough, though Izuku nearly fell multiple times and had to use her quirk on herself to keep upright and to save herself from one nasty fall. The top three runners were displayed on the Jumbotron and shown to be Candy-cane, now known to be named Shototodoroki, was in first. The kid with explosions, Katsuki Bakugou, that name sounded familiar to Izuku, was in second, and very close behind Todoroki. Third place was Izumi, and she was rushing like a madwoman after Bakugou. Izuka and Izuki were in 12th and 13th respectively, and still going through the race together and overall just making sure they both get through it all. The frontrunners finally made it to the last obstacle, which was a non-lethal minefield made with heavy sound waves to send someone flying. Todoroki continued freezing his way through, covering the mines and causing them to not explode. Bakugou just flew over them, still using his quirk to catch up to Todoroki, and Izumi just watched her step while bolting after Bakugou still. One kid thought he could make it through by just running faster than the mines. He didn't last long. Eventually, all three front runners P-butted the minefield and made it into the final stretch and close to the tunnel leading to victory. The three entered and everyone in the crowd went quiet waiting for whoever won to enter the stadium. "Hell yeah," Izuku yelled, immediately followed by a roaring crowd as Izukumidoriya and Katsuki Bakugou ran out of the tunnel with the former's head held high. Izuku's smile could have rivaled All Might on a great day, and Rumi could have competed for best grin of the year. Todoroki came in right behind the two victories with a neutral face, but walked off after staring at the duo now yelling at each other in front of millions of spectators. The other contestants eventually made it to the stadium, including Izuka and Izuki at a comfortable 7th and 8th place, though only the contestants above 43 could continue, while everyone else was sent to their CL Butts designated areas to watch the rest of the sports festival. A few minutes were given so the competilancers could rest before the next event, but once Midnight retook the stage, she announced they'd be doing a cavalry battle. Izuku had never been a fan of cavalry battles. His team would always fall in his middle school festivals. Rumi was always better as the front horse in those situations if he wanted any chance of winning. The cavalry battle went for about 15 minutes and ended with Bakugou's team, which consisted of the triplets, at the stop spot even after Team Todoroki had taken their 10 million point headband after 3 minutes, but T-10 seconds before the bell signaling the end, they pulled a 100-ick play and used a mix of Izuka's quirk and Izumi to distract the rider of Team Todoroki, while Izuki used her quirk to pull the headband straight to her. The event ended with Team Bakugou in first, Team Todoroki in second, Team Kirishima in third, and two other teams Izuku literally cared less for. "Breaks on, see you in a bit," Izuku said, hopping over the couch and heading to the door. Midnight had just called for a 43-minute break until the 1v1 fights started, and Izuku wanted to get a few words in with his sisters. Yeah, Rumi waved while using the new space on the couch to stretch her body. Izuku placed his coat back on as he walked out of the VIP room and into the hall. Izuku readjusted his sleeves as he made his way down a stairwell toward what he believed to be the contestant rooms. He stepped off the stairwell into a slightly isolated hall and turned to see a sight so shocking he froze. Izumi was making out with that kid, Bakugou Katsuki. Izuku's brow twitched as brotherly instincts demanded he tear the ashen blonde's lips off his sister's and then shove a lump of burning coal into his mouth while wrapped up in the rider's chains. Izuku didn't even realize his eyes flashed orange for a moment before marching up to the two. They were rather engrossed in what was happening, so Izuku positioned himself behind Bakugou and leaned on the wall in the position of Izumi's sight as soon as she opened her eyes, which she did a few moments after he positioned himself. Izumi tensed visibly as she saw the grin her brother was sporting and the predatory glare he was sending toward Bakugou. "Izuku," she screeched while detaching herself from the blonde. "Izumi?" What's wrong? Bakugou never finished his sentence as a hand grabbed his shoulder and the hallway felt cold all of a sudden. Bakugou slowly turned his head toward the hand that was clasped onto his shoulder, which seemed to be getting warmer. Bakugou turned his head up and finally saw the face of Izuku staring at him with a grin he'd recognized as one Bakugou himself had sported in a fight. Only this grin was directed at him and far more vicious than his own would ever have any right to be. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air was cold, and it was just Katsuki and Izuku. Izuku's hand got warmer and warmer. Asterisk wham asterisk. Izuku doubled over after Izumi rammed her elbow into his gut. He laughed it off, however, and backed up as Izumi pointed at him threateningly. Was that really necessary? Izuku, you didn't have to scare Kaken like that, Izumi yelled, still pointing at Izuku. Well, what you expect me to do? I come down those stairs, he points his thumb back toward the stairwell, and see you and this kid shoving tongues, and you expect me not to pull rank? You haven't ever pulled rank. Yeah, I have. When? 6 years old. Comic store. Candy pellets. Was all Izuku said, and Izumi's face burst into metaphorical flames. You said you'd never speak of that. I'm not. Simply reminding you of a time I pulled rank as the older brother. As the two siblings squabbled, Bakugou just watched with a face basically declaring WTF. He eventually shook his head and said, Izumi, who the hell is this? Izumi and Izuku stopped, remembering that Bakugou was still standing there, and turned to the confused teenager with perfect synchronicity. He's my older brother. Izuku, introduce yourself to my boyfriend, Izumi said. Izuku looked at Bakugou, sizing him up before bringing up his hand. Izukumidoriya, Izumi's older brother. Bakugou grabbed the offered hand and shook it. Katsuki Bakugou, Izumi's boyfriend and future #1 hero. The claim to being the future N1 didn't really do anything for Izuku besides giving him the belief of Bakugou being somewhat boastful. All right, nice to meet you, Bakugou. Izuku turned away from Bakugou to Izumi. Anyway, just wanted to get a chance to speak to you before the 1v1s. I've still gotta talk to Izuki and Izuka, so if I want to catch them I gotta go. All right, love you Izuku, Izumi said. You too. Izuku walked past them and continued on his way to find Izuka and Izuki. Geez, Bakugou finally said, I get the whole older brother shtick, but using your quirk to intimidate someone? Really? Izumi just looked at Bakugou like he was stupid. My brother's quirkless, idiot. What? I coulda sworn. Then you imagined it. My brother never got a quirk. Izumi's mood noticeably dampened as she said that. It caused a lot of issues for him, but he still keeps going, or he wouldn't be here. She mumbled out that last part too quietly for Bakugou to hear. Bakugou stared at the retreating form of Izuku, quirkless. Then could I have imagined that? Izuku walked around the halls looking down farther halls and asking random students he came across about Izuka and Izuki. Two of them, a kid with a crow's head and an unhealthy amount of emo vibes, and a kid with a blue gator and multiple arms, told Izuku he'd probably find Izuka and Izuki up at the a locker rest area. Izuku thanked them and made his way up another floor and around a few halls. After another corner, he saw Izuki at the end of the hall talking with someone. He was tall, skinny, so much so Izuku was kinda worried about the guy's health, and had blonde hair. Izuku got closer, and he was able to hear a snippet or two of what they were saying. Something about one for all and all might. Izuku was now right up behind them and smirked. So, what are we talking about? Izuki and the guy stood ramrod straight, and the guy seemed to be leaking BLD from his mouth. Both of them turned toward him, and Izuki immediately realized what had just happened. Izuku, don't scare me like that. Sorry, couldn't help it. You were just so susceptible to it. Izuku answered easily, but besides that, how are you feeling? For what? In general, or for the 1v1s? Why not both? Well, I'm confident I'll be able to defeat a few of my opponents by pushing them out of the ring. It'd just depend on the size of it, and if they have a quirk that allows them to take to the air. What if for the ones that can take to the air you bring them toward you and try to get them on the ground before pushing them out? That could work, but I'm not exactly confident in my hand-to-hand when they get close. A cough from next to them made them realize both had gone off track and forgotten about the tall blonde man. The tall blonde looked between them with unveiled confusion. Young Midoriya, he began, looking at Izuku. Who is this man? Oh, sorry, all Miyagi-sensei, she corrected with a panicked look. This is my older brother, Izukumidoriya, who should be up in the stands waiting for the 1v1s to start. She finished with a pointed look toward Izuku. What? Can your older brother not check up on his sisters before they have to beat the tar out of each other in the 1v1s? Izuku attempted to answer but kept stuttering. Do not worry, young Midoriya, Yagi said to Izuku before turning to Izuku. I believe you are allowed to be down here, but I'm unsure if any heroes roaming the halls will know that. Izuku waved Yagi off. If a hero has a problem with me speaking with my sisters, I'll just give them a piece of my mind or secretly record them giving me SHT and post it online, ruining the career of the hero and slowly driving them into a sense of inferiority until they believe the whole world is against them and hang up their cape forever, and from then on being known as the hero who wouldn't let an older brother see his sisters. Izuku and Yagi just stared at Izuku after his rant in silence while Izuku smiled back. Anyway, what exactly do you teach my sister? Yagi coughed to dispel the mental image Izuku gave him with his small rant. I'm just her trainer, trying to get her to be the best hero she can be. Really? Yeah. Well, you've done a rather swell job. From what I can tell, Izuku's quirk is a lot stronger than I remember it being. Wasn't that the truth? Izuku remembered Izuku's quirk being capable of pulling up to 50 PND before he left. Now, if Izuku was correct in what he's seen, Izuku could pull and push things weighing up to a few hundred PND. Yeah, I'm proud of how far young Midoriya has come, Yagi said with an obvious sense of pride in his voice. Izuku visibly beamed at the praise and Izuku couldn't help the small smile that crept up on his own lips. Good, anyway I best get going, I still have to find Izuku, Izuku said. Oh, I think she'll be in the one awaiting rooms about a floor up, Izuku said. Izuku smiled and ruffled her hair. Thanks, Izuku, good luck in your matches and remember to kick their butts. With that, Izuku began his trek to find Izuku. As Izuku climbed up a stairwell, he checked his watch to see how much time he had left for the break and nearly tripped when he saw he only had 10 minutes left. Increasing his speed, he walked up the stairs going 2 steps at a time. Izuku eventually came to the floor. He wanted lightly breathing from the speed he came up at and immediately set off for down the hall, p-butting a few random students as he went. Izuku rounded a corner and began hearing muffled voices from a waiting room with a plaque on the door. He stopped in front of the door for a moment and listened to the muffled voices. Yep, one of those voices was Izuku. Smiling to himself, he knocked on the door in a rhythmic tune. A few sounds of shuffling came from the door before it was opened by a tall guy with blue hair and GL butts. Yes? Blue hair asked. Is Izukumidoriya in there by any chance? Izuku asked. Yes. Why do you require her, sir? Name's Izukumidoriya, and I just want to talk to my sister is all. The kid's face lit up and nodded. Midoriya, the kid turned around toward the room. It's your brother. The sound of a chair scrping across the floor signaled Izuku to stand up, and the kid opened the door so Izuku could see Izuku marching forward with determination. Izuku immediately began backing slightly. Now, no need to do anything, BR. Before Izuku could finish, Izuku dashed forward and placed her fist directly into his gut. Izuku stumbled back into the wall groaning. Come on, what is with you and Izumi with the gut punches? Maybe you should be less enthusiastic about your choice in cheering on your sisters, Izuku replied. Oh, but that's the best way. How am I supposed to cheer on someone if I don't have their merch? That's not official merchandise. So you're saying you will get some when you go pro. It'll be for the M-butts and not you. Izuku placed a hand over his heart and recoiled as if hit. Oh, you wound me. I'm not considered a part of the M-butts in your eyes. Of course not. You are my older brother, and that makes you superior and be held to different standards. Oh, so the Midoriya family is a bunch of nobles, huh? If I make it as a popular hero, then yes, that is how we'd be treated. I have no doubts Izumi will become a top hero and Izuku will become a paragon for the people, so you should be prepared for that either way. Hearing the way she spoke so confidently about what their sisters would become, but making it seem she wouldn't, made Izuku frown. That's not always the case. Your quirk isn't lacking in power if that's why you think you won't make it. Izuku simply shook her head. That's not what I mean. Izumi and Izuki have far more open personalities than me. Izumi is loud and boisterous, even if she needs to watch that mouth of hers, and Izuki is practically a shining ball of optimism. I'm neither of those things. My personality is nowhere near those two. Statistically, my mannerisms are not anywhere near the personality to be one of those. People love heroes that grin and shout out things. I'm not one of those. I'm fine with how it'll go, however, as I don't plan on being the best. I just want to help people. Izuku was quiet for a moment, digesting what he heard. A few moments after he smiled. I think you put far too much thought into statistics. Heroes have shattered those expectations placed on them before, and while I have no idea what you're being taught, I think you still have a few years to learn what kind of hero you'll be. Izuka's lip twitched at Izuku's words, as close to a smile you'd usually get from her aside from a few incidents. She nodded, but before any more words could be said, an announcement came over the intercom. Breaks over, people, President Mike announced. UA students who've gotten to the finals, come on down for a total beatdown. Izuku looked up, and then back to Izuka. Well, good luck, Izuka. With that, and a small head pat, Izuku walked back off to the VIP booth and momentarily realized those two students with Izuka never introduced themselves. It's not like he needed to know their names. Izuku came back to Rumi stuffing 3 carrots into her mouth. She had threatened if a rumor got out about her and what she was doing, Izuku would be kicked to the moon. Izuku had simply responded by saying he'd be the first human on the moon to have been kicked there. They settled on the couch and watched as the remaining contestants duke it out. The first battle was between Izuki and some kid who looked like he needed sleep. Poor guy got blasted out by Izuki using her quirk to push him out of bounds. The second fight wasn't much of a fight and more of a curb stomp. The ice kid made a glacier to encase the kid with cellophane tape dispenser arms. Honestly, Izuku was curious as to why the ice kid felt the need to do that. The third fight was more interesting, as it was Izuka and some girl who had her hands together in what seemed like a prayer. The girl also had vines for hair, so it wasn't a very fair matchup, as Izuka burned the vines and Seeker punched the vine girl with enough force to knock her out. Well, at least he knew Izuka hit other people just as strong as she hit him. The next fight made Izuku rather nostalgic. A fight between the blue-haired kid, Tenya Ida, and Mei Hatsume. Ren must be so proud of her. Izuku had met Mei once when she was young, and even then she had an eye for machinery. Of course, Mei had turned the whole fight into an ad about her inventions. Oh, Ren had to be so proud of her. The next fight wasn't that interesting. If anything, it was rather embarrassing. Poor guy got his breathes burned by acid and his underwear exposed to the world before receiving an uppercut. It was around the next fight that Izuku suddenly remembered something. Oh, SHT, Izuku exclaimed. Rumi jumped a little with the suddenness of the exclamation as she was focused on the fights. What? Rumi said back, wondering what made Izuku yell out in worry. Rumi, Izuku hesitantly looked at her. How did those spring and summer months go? Silence. Complete silence beside the rumbling of the crowd roaring at what seemed to be the end of the current bot. Rumi stared at Izuku with a blank face as Izuku began sweating a bit. And you bring this up, why? Rumi said, her face deadpan and her voice monotone. Well, it just popped in there, just a random thought, and it made me realize I don't know how those times went, so I'm just wondering if you got a replacement. Replacement. Is that really what you just called them? I don't have any other way of saying it. What? You want me to say, hey Rumi, did you find another sec buddy since I left you? Don't just say that. Rumi sighed. Well, I'm happy to inform you that you have been replaced. Great, so he treats you well? She treats me just fine. She? Batting for the other team, are you, Rumi? It was a mutual agreement. I met her at a party I was asked to be at, and those urges kicked in while there. Thankfully she recognized them and we got to talking. She had a similar problem, but apparently had better control of it since her quirk doesn't really involve an actual animal, but she still has a heat cycle, funnily enough. Anyway, she offered, so we went to an apartment and ravaged each other until the morning and have been meeting for the last 6 years. Well, that's good. Admittedly, I thought you might have just held those urges with an iron grip. No, that's a bad idea. My doctor has told me before that doing that makes the person a ticking time bomb. It's not a good idea. People with a quirk that causes a heat cycle cannot be ignored, it just makes it worse. and you can be prone to jumping the first person that makes a saucy joke. Yeah, I can only imagine the carnage. Izuku shivered at the image of Mirko running down some random guy or girl for her carnal longings. Yeah, I'm good, Rumi waved off. Besides that, I've been all over the country, and I don't plan on sticking to Musutafu that long. How long? About a month at most. I've already been here for a few weeks though. Really? Yeah, haven't looked at the news of me kicking villain butt. Admittedly, I haven't really sat down to watch the news in a while. Izuku had more pressing matters, specifically trying to mend family ties, which has gone well so far. You haven't? Then, do you know about the ghostwriter? Yeah, I know about it. Rumi turned back toward the fights currently going on, her eyes narrowing before she spoke. I still can't believe he wasn't caught in that whole mess. A week, a F-seeking week of that DMN villain on a rampage, and nobody could stop him. No one could even keep pace. That F-seeking monster killed more people than any villain in Japan in the last 2 decades, basically slaughtered all of the northern villain gangs that stayed out of sight. Rumi growled out that last bit while Izuku listened to her. Honestly, I wish I'd been here when this SHT happened. I'd have kicked that DMN skull right off. Moreover, I wish All Might was there. He'd have made that villain look like small fry, but since he's tied himself down to Musutafu because of Yua, he's stuck here. Rumi sighed as she caught herself before she continued ranting. Sound like you really hate the ghostwriter. That probably wasn't the right thing to say as Rumi began speaking again. Oh tilde, I do. He's the murderer of nearly 300 people in Japan alone. If it were just villains, I'd probably not care as much, but he went after normal people as well. People with no prior crimes or even a F-seeking parking ticket. Those people didn't have that coming. Rumi finally couldn't help herself and began ranting. Izuku listened as the rant stretched to even include statistics on how society seemed to be reacting to the incident people have begun to call the ghost incident. Not a very creative name, but it's gained traction in media and online discussions. Izuku listened to all this, but his own thoughts still broke through. Izuku seriously doubted the writer went after any innocents. That wasn't its thing. The writer knows what people have done, and if it believes the sin is unforgivable or simply too gruesome, it won't hesitate. While the police may not know what the victims did to give the writer cause for its actions, Izuku had a pretty good idea. It held the obese man in its grasp. Ah, she wanted it. She was practically... I didn't even know him. Please, I didn't. She never finished as she was decapitated by its chain. Please, cash, drugs, women, men, whatever you w. She didn't finish as it lit her ablaze. Flashes of when the writer is in control come to him sometimes. Not a lot, so he never gets the full picture, just enough to understand. No one that the writer killed was innocent, but he wouldn't blame the heroes and police for thinking that. So, what is the plan for the ghostwriter? Izuku asked. TCH, I haven't been informed. The general consensus for most heroes is to call for backup. The ghostwriter is very strong with that mutant quirk, and because of his fiery visage, Endeavor has been barred from attempting to fight with him. Which is fair. 2 fiery combatants going at each other is a recipe for damage and casualties. Izuku didn't ask anything more after that. It was obvious the writer was a topic to be dropped and just watched the continuing matches with Rumi, who was quiet for the rest of the fights. Well, that was the sports festival, and Izuku would gladly admit he preferred to see it on the TV. It got so many more angles than just watching from above the arena. Izuku watched the reward ceremony and clapped when Izuki got the second-place medal from All Might of all people. She must have been so happy to see her idol in person. Izuku watched as the festival began winding down, and when Present Mike came on to the intercom, announcing the end of the sports festival, Izuku stood up. Leaving? Rumi asked from her spot on the couch. Yeah, I'm gonna drive the triplets home, so I gotta meet up with them, Izuku answered as he tucked a shirt into the suitcase. Well, hold on a moment. Rumi got up and walked over to a table on the side of the room where she grabbed a notepad and a pencil. A few moments of writing later, and Rumi set down the pencil and walked over to Izuku and stuck the pad to his forehead. Make sure to call, will ya? Izuku grabs the notepad and looks at Rumi. I will, but also remember to call me if you're having issues. Rumi smiles. I will, but don't worry, any physical issues are now put onto my new sec bud, so it'll just be emotional or very long venting session about how my day went. and how I'm somewhat uncomfortable with how many people take photos of my butt and maximize the picture to get a peek underneath, or how I've been asked some rather embarrassing questions by random fans, and how one has literally asked me if I have a heat cycle. Kami, I was so tempted to kick that guy to the moon. Can I take back my previous statement? Nope, you're stuck with me and my badge, Rumi enthusiastically stated. Great, well, I better get going, Izuku said, turning towards the door. Ha, yeah, see you Zoo, Rumi said. See you later, dumb bunny. With that, Izuku walks out of the room and into the hallway. On his way, he p-butts a lanky man in a white suit with a red polka dot tie on his way to meet with Mirko. Why was the number 6 hero standing next to you? How do you know each other? When did you meet? These were just a few of the questions Izuku had been butt-alted with as soon as he and the triplets had gotten home. He deflected the questions as best he could, but that stopped working after they tackled him and dragged him to a wooden chair before tying him to it and placing a collapsible table in front of him and sitting down across it. All the room needed was a one-way mirror and a convenient lamp above them, and it'd be straight out of a movie. I just knew her in school, he finally answered after a near hour of constant questioning. Izumi pumped her fist as he said that, probably happy they broke him down. Which school? Izuki asked, now wearing black shades that blocked her eyes. Aldera, she transferred in a few months after the first year began. Wait, you've known her that long, Izumi said, slamming her palms down on the table. Well, yeah. And you never told us. Well, I didn't know she'd be number 5. I knew she'd get pretty high in the charts, but I guess I kinda underestimated her. Well, don't keep it to yourself. What's she like? Izuka asked from her seat. Hostile, most certainly a little beaky, but under that she's got a bit of a soft spot. Course if I tell her that she'll knock my teeth out, but what she doesn't know won't hurt me. I'll hurt you if you talk SHT about Mirko, Izumi said, folding her arms. Threat of torture is against the law, which means you have to let me go, Izuku replied with a playful tone. The Council of Siblings has no such law, Izuka said with a small smirk. This council is corrupt. All sibling councils are corrupt, Izuku. We're siblings in a council dedicated to getting what the fellow siblings besides one want, by any means necessary. And what do the siblings want? The goddamn deets, Izuku. Izumi gets smacked across the face with a newspaper wielded by Izuki. Enough, Izumi, he gets the point. Izuki lowered the newspaper and looked back at Izuku. Izuku, we are teenage girls. We always want the deets, dear brother. Izuku sighed miserably. He really hoped this interrogation would end soon. Rumi tapped her foot impatiently. She'd been waiting with a few other heroes in the Naya agency's lobby for 10 minutes now. She'd been waiting for this since the first meeting. Nightai had ended it with the promise of a future get-together when the files arrived. He also came to her personally at the US Sports Festival to tell her about this meeting. So why the hell was it taking so long? Freakin' Nightai, making us wait on such an important meeting. What the hell is taking him so long? She muttered as she continued tapping her foot. After a few more minutes, the door to the meeting room finally opened, and Sir Nightai strode out to look over the waiting room. I apologize for the wait, but we needed to get things set up. There is a lot we need to cover. With that, Nightai walked back into the room and the heroes followed. Centipter and Bubble Girl stood off to the side of a large screen while Sir Nightai went to the front of the table and gestured for them to sit. Mirko looked around the meeting room and was surprised to see several evidence boxes lining the walls around the room. She figured an international villain would have a lot of evidence against them, but it was still surprising to see how much there was. Is this all of it? Mirko found herself asking as she sat down. Unfortunately, no, it's simply what we were able to gather. There is far more physical evidence kept in police lots, but those would require heavy lifting, and it was decided to just use the documents. What they could gather. That didn't sound great. I'm also to tell you that the HPSC has taken a vested interest in this case and has given us permission to use whatever resource is needed to find and capture the ghostwriter, Nightai announced, causing whispers amongst the heroes present, and Mirko couldn't blame them. The HPSC was a busy organization with far too much SHT on its plate to get fully involved in a single task force. The fact they were personally funding the task force and telling them to use whatever resource they needed was enough for Mirko to know they were taking this far more seriously than they had in the past. With that, we'll get to the true goal of this meeting, finding the Ghost Rider's current base of operations. Izuku stood on the balcony from the living room of his family's apartment. He's staring up at the stars, wondering, wishing, and thinking about things long since past. His mind is mostly on the events of the day and how proud he truly was of his sisters. It's just a sad truth that all this was going to come to an end eventually. A month had already butted. Izuku had promised himself that he'd enjoy it as long as he could before the inevitable end. Staying in a singular place for as long as he has was always dangerous. There was always a chance for someone to discover who he was, and someone going after his family for that, so he'd eventually have to leave again, even if it would break his family's collective heart. His thoughts were interrupted by his phone buzzing in his pocket. He fished it from his pocket and looked at who was calling him. Guess she misses me already. The caller ID read the dumb bunny. He swiped the answer button and brought the phone to his ear. Hey Rumi, is there something you need at? He checked the time. 2 o'clock in the morning. Hey Zu, I was wondering if it's possible you could come over? Rumi asked, her voice tired. Is there a reason? Can't sleep. Need someone to talk to, and I'd rather talk to them face to face instead of on the phone. Something happened? Can you or can't you? Rumi groused. Izuku looked back over his shoulder, looking at the blinds that separated him from the living room and back to his phone. He had planned on reconnecting with Rumi even a little bit, so he supposed this was his good chance besides their encounter at the UA Sports Festival. Sure, why not? Izuku replied. All right, I'm set up at Clover Avenue. You know where that is, don't you? Wait, you mean that street lined with blossoms? Yup. Never understood why it was called Clover Avenue. And I doubt we ever will see you soon, Izuku. The call disconnected. Izuku looks down at the phone for a while before looking out over Musatafu, the city barely highlighted in the dark in front of all the stars. Izuku turned and went back inside, going to his room and grabbing a piece of paper and a pencil. He wrote that he was going out and would be back tomorrow before heading over to the kitchen and placing the note on the refrigerator. He nodded at the note and then turned back towards the balcony and headed out. He stopped on the balcony and smiled at the view before turning to his right and vaulting over the balcony. He grabbed the pipe and began his descent to the concrete below. The Plymouth growled to a halt on the house's driveway. Izuku twisted the key and the engine shut off. He got out and looked at the house. It was a single-story modern home, but it didn't really stand out. Izuku wondered if that was the point, as Rumi did value her privacy. Izuku walked up to the door and pressed the button he assumed to be the doorbell. A few moments later, and the door opened to reveal Rumi clad in sweat breathes and a gray sports br. Overall, Izuku thought it was a good look on her. Hey, sleepyhead, Izuku greeted. Hey Zu, come in, just don't stare at my abs, Rumi said before heading back in. The door left open for Izuku. Izuku took the invitation and walked into the house, closing the door behind him and slipping his shoes off. He followed the rabbit hero into the living room, where 2 couches sat opposite each other, weirdly. What's with the couches? Izuku asked. The house isn't mine, it's a rental from that friend I mentioned at the sports festival, Rumi said while sitting down and stretching her legs out. Ah, the sec friend. Yup. You ever gonna tell me who that is, by the way? Probably not. Fair, Izuku said, sitting down opposite Rumi. So what's the issue? Rumi immediately growled and punched the cushion next to her. It's that DMN villain. A little more specific, please. The friggin' ghostrider, that guy. Oh, Izuku mentally sighed as he realized he was in for a rant about himself and it. I mean, Rumi began, already standing up to pace around the room, sleepiness forgotten. This FANFICTION guy comes out of nowhere in Japan and goes on a rampage, killing hundreds of people in northern Japan, the most deaths Japan has seen from a single villain attack. And if all that wasn't enough, he got away. More so was the meeting I had several hours ago, which delved far deeper into this international villain. Rumi didn't stop. For the next several minutes, perhaps longer, Rumi ranted about the ghostrider and what he'd done to people across the world. All the while Izuku listened with a neutral face. He didn't blame her for having that opinion. Izuku had heard her talk about the writer earlier, and he had the same opinion then. Nobody understood why the writer did this, and nobody could unless he explained it to them, or they were latched onto as well. He knew no one would believe him completely anyway. Who would? Izuku listened as she ranted and got a little more detailed, and he was reminded of several incidents that happened in America, but overall it was stuff that he was already well aware of considering he was the ghostwriter. The rant seems to be winding down as Rumi's tired mind is making her slightly sluggish as she speaks. Her voice was still impassioned, but her movements were slower. She wasn't pacing as much anymore, and for the last minute, she's just been standing in front of the couch ranting. She eventually went quiet and looked over at the hallway leading to other rooms in the house. Rumi glances at Izuku, who is still sitting on the couch, with a thoughtful expression. Moments later, Izuku was being dragged off from the couch and into the hall. "Ooh, what is happening?" Izuku asked as he was dragged. "Sleep," Rumi said. "So we're sleeping together." "Yup, I'm tired and you're here, so you can be my body pillow for tonight." "Oh, what an honor, I shall gladly accept." "You don't have a choice here." "I know, but the illusion of one at least helps with that." Rumi opened a door at the end of the hall and Izuku was dragged into the doorway before being physically thrown across the room and landing square on a bed. The next moment a weight slammed into his chest as Rumi hopped on him. Rumi adjusted herself and wrapped her arms around him, muttering a good night and a few moments later snoring. She fell asleep instantly as Izuku simply lay there. He felt a pang of amusement course through his body at the situation as it brought back old memories of similar happenings when they were younger. He sighed in satisfaction at going back to old habits and closed his eyes. It took a little longer than usual, but Izuku fell asleep. Help. Izuku's eyes snapped open. His head turned and his eyes darted around the pitch-black room. Nothing but the sound of Rumi's breathing could be heard in the room. No one besides him and Rumi was in the room. Izuku looked back to the ceiling in confusion. Did he really hear that, or was he just dreaming? And why did it sound like a little girl pleading for help? So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author otherwise Rook on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.